Welcome to the Level Up Artist Podcast for your hosts, Adriana Amay and
Jackie Sanders. We're two art professionals sharing for the advice and business lessons we have learned along our creative journeys.
we talk to artists, leaders, and art professionals to demystify the creative process and discover new ways to succeed as a career-minded artist.
If you find value in these conversations, please go ahead and subscribe. This will help other creatives like you find our podcast, and you'll be notified when we drop a new episode every Tuesday. Now, today's episode is going to be a bit of a gut punch episode, so brace yourself, guys. Because in our mission to demystify the creative process, we also want to demystify that business side of being an artist and what goes on behind the scenes truly when running an art business this day and age. So that also includes making collectors not just digital content for fun consumption for our audience. And yes, we do acknowledge this is a little bit ironic because we are producing, of course, a podcast episode piece of content about this point. But for the sake of today's episode, as part of your art business, this is our way of expressing ourselves, right? Of building a community, leaning into community over competition. The content that we make as artists is included in the podcast. In addition to, of course, our other forms of creative, being paintings, art products, sculptures, murals, all the other fun studio things that we think up. Our podcast is just another one of those things too.
Yeah, yeah, and I love that idea too, because we get so much pressure and we hear so much noise about like making content that will have a specific result on social media. Where sometimes, yes, as artists, like Jackie mentioned, like we have so many things that create content versus let's say a brand that doesn't have much interesting to create content about. So they kind of have to have some sort of fluff. But for us, our content is what we make. But then we have to be careful not just to perform in a way. So
Mm-hmm.
we'll dive more into that. But I do want to say, like, when we talk about content, we're specifically referring to things like social media posts, blog posts, other types of digital, content that we share online, and want to make sure that today's episode, it is a super common conversation for career-minded artists. Like one of the things that always keeps coming up is how much time you should be spending on your studio practice, making the work versus the admin side, selling and marketing our work. And sometimes, honestly, that also includes how much time should we spend editing videos for social media, that one, or making captions. Like that is part of the conversation now. According to Alex Peg's book Rest, which is awesome, and there'll be links in today's show notes, on average, creatives typically have 4 hours of quote unquote genius time per day, and that's seen as a that inflow focused creative time. But we also tend to use rest, play, and exercise in ways that help us be more creative too. And of course, that four is not a universal number. Everybody's going to be a little bit different. I was joking with Jackie before we started recording. Depending how much espresso I have in me and my body, it's how many hours I can get out. But yes, obviously, there needs to be a balance. You can't just make, make, make. That's going to deplete the creative tank. You need to have the time to refill it as well.
Yeah, and one thing I love about Alex Pang's book is I've heard the book mentioned on a couple of different podcasts, and I'm in the middle of the audiobook itself, which is really good, is that idea that rest isn't necessarily I am sitting here doing nothing time, right? We can leverage different parts of our day to refuel our creative tank as artists, right? So let's say, for example, we're assuming you get 8 hours of sleep. Of course, we're talking in perfect world scenarios. You get 8 hours of sleep. Let's say you have 8 hours of personal time during the day, friends, family, errands, house chores, all of that. And then 8 hours of work. If you are the place where you're a full-time artist, four of that can be art making, maybe the other four of the art making in terms of that core genius time. And then that other four can be the more admin business side of things, because that other four should really be focused on selling the work that you're making those collectors, and not totally focused on making fun, lighthearted content for people to see, let's say on TikTok and Instagram. Even though we know it's super easy to get into that rabbit hole, to Adriana's point from before, because that is the part where you are producing a physical piece of content. You're able to check it off your list, say, look, I produced this thing with my time. I'm done. But having that 4 hour time to really focus on making collectors can be way more beneficial for your business. And of course, these hours, as we mentioned before, will be different. It's not going to be the perfect 8 8 8 breakdown every single day, or even depending on your schedule. Of course, if you have additional forms of income, if you have a full-time day job, having other responsibilities in your life, this will change, but the point still remains the same of being intentional with the time that you do spend in your creative practice and in your art business.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned not the same for everyone. It's also it can change during seasons. So
Mhm.
there may be some seasons that are a lot more art making heavy, and then there's also going to be seasons that are a lot more admin heavy, especially if there's a lot of follow-ups, you're doing commissions, you're applying to open calls, doing RFQs, things like that. Obviously keep an eye on your time. You've heard us before. If you've heard us before, you've heard us preach on this one before. You need to track your time and see where you're at. Otherwise, the idea of how long you're spending on these things and the reality of it may not match up. So definitely track your time. And while things like spending admin time on things like sales or sales efforts might feel awkward for at first for many artists, if you're career minded, it's income streams, right? Whether you're part time or full time, you have to think of income streams. Selling is actually what gets you the money to fuel, to continue your creative practice, right? Again, if you're career minded, if you're doing this on the side for fun, great, you don't have to worry about this. But if you're trying to generate some kind of income out of it, as better or worse, art, being a professional artist, it could necessarily, selling is part of it. Let's just call it that. Let's just straight up call it that, right? In some way, shape, or form, selling is a lot of times a part of it. So this could be a super hard mindset shift for a lot of artists because the sales process behind the scenes is not necessarily seen by others. There's also folks that are fighting the icky factor that they feel with the sales process. Um, there's also like the fact that we see all these content creators, fellow artists, putting all this stuff online, but we don't necessarily see what's behind the scenes. Like, are they spending more time doing videos than making art? And then they're just recycling content, right? Like, there's a lot of things that we don't see that happen behind the scenes, that could lead to generating sales and growing collector bases. So that's like the part where we try through the podcast to like try to demystify some of these things. But we definitely want to stress the point that even if it may look like they're being oh so successful online and they're spending all this time and they have all these wonderfully produced videos on their Instagram or TikTok or whatever, um, it's not necessarily just the content that's driving that. A lot of times it's those conversations and relationships that they're building behind the scenes. We scream this off the top of the rooftops anytime we get a chance, of course, but the art, if you do art as a career, it's a relationship business through and through. Instagram and TikTok and online is one way to help build that relationship, but it is not the only way, and it is not even necessarily the most effective way. A lot of times, that handshake in person is the way to go, but of course, not always possible with us, spread all over. But just know it's just one part of that formula. It's not just ta-da, I made this, now buy it, and that's it. There's a lot more involved.
Yeah, exactly. And we talk all the time on the podcast about building a sustainable art business, right? That isn't necessarily dependent on Instagram as a single platform, as TikTok as a single platform, which there is definitely nothing wrong with doing that. However, from an art business standpoint, thinking long term for your business, it is about those real relationships. And of course, I love social media. We have episodes and course modules that focus totally on that because social media is a great top of the funnel marketing strategy to get eyes on your work, to nurture relationships that you've already created, to be the cold introduction to new people. If you do have a video that goes viral, sharing pieces of your story as people are passively consuming content online. But it isn't necessarily scalable, and it also isn't a direct, tangible way to grow your business, right? And I think a lot of the time we as artists and even just small business owners in general can fall down that loop of feeling like your homework, so to speak, as admin of your business is to, oh, I have to make this number of social media posts a week, this number of videos. But realistically, and this is kind of where that gut punch moment comes in, is that idea of being productive versus feeling productive, because we all know the satisfaction of checking things off your to-do list, putting out in the world, look, I made this video, and getting that immediate endorphin rush, serotonin, all the good feelings of putting it out there, have people like your posts, but really asking yourself, are you doing this and is it actually being productive, or do you just feel like you're being productive? Because those can be really different things. Again, having social media as a top of the funnel marketing strategy is great, but there is that point where sometimes we create more work for ourselves rather than getting a lot of return from it. So there is that point of having to ask yourself, I think, especially in the business of being an artist and wanting to build a collector base, people that connect with you and your work and your story, is really asking yourself, is this action that I'm taking creating more human interaction and engagement with my artwork? It's focusing on that relationship building. So when you sit down to do your admin tasks, is it building human interaction and engagement with the work that you are making? Because really, that is what it's all about when you're building a collector base.
Yeah, and I love that you just said that because a lot of times, like, this is a question, whether emerging, mid-career, even advanced career, aside from your studio practice as an artist, you really need to focus on marketing your work, selling your work, building relationships. But a lot of people, I feel like, go down that rabbit hole of like, I need to do this to get more likes, to get more followers, to get the algorithm to smile upon me, right? And it's like, that doesn't really matter. If you're just posting for an algorithm, the algorithm isn't buying from you. Let's just start right there, right? That's part of like
Mhm.
what we're trying to get across. I mean, yes, you want to see what the algorithm trends and things are to take advantage of things that can help your post reach further. But if that's all you're focusing on, it's not enough. Like that, if it falls flat on its face with your collectors, and you did it just because you read that funny videos get bigger reach, but your collectors aren't really necessarily interested in that, then what was the point? Then you're attracting the wrong people, right? You want the ones that actually want to support you, not just be entertained by you, which is a whole nother bag of chips. So there's that. But like with this is when you start like telling people you are an artist. You want to tell everyone. It can be scary at first, but that confidence starts building as you start going, right? And you stop hiding from saying you're an artist. Obviously, depending how comfortable you're with this, how much you want to elaborate upon it, but like essentially like take advantage of this part of the art business, like we're always saying, like marketing is not icky. Artist marketing is telling your story. Like, lean into that. You get to tell your own narrative. You get to tell your own story in your own way, in your own words. Like, you get to display your evolution in your own way. Like, lean into that, right? Tell everybody about it. Yes, it is part of the sales process, but it doesn't have to be icky. It can be 100% authentic. These are the types of conversations where showing them your work, asking them to follow you on social media, asking for emails, especially if you're doing, some kind of in-person event and things like that. These are the kind of things where you're like, hey, especially if you're meeting them in person for the first time, make that first relationship and then use social media to kind of drip back into that conversation, like for them to not forget about you, because there's so much we look at, right? And out of sight, out of mind. Use that social media to then help maintain that relationship over time. Because not everybody's going to have time to follow up with, like, thousands of people. So that's where that comes in handy. But if you're doing that in an authentic way, you're leaving that positive impression, and then you're using social media to kind of reinforce what that impression is, right? For when they need artwork later on down the road. But you do need to tell them you're an artist and you have stuff for sale.
Exactly. And a lot of that is about breadcrumbing the interaction, right? It's like starting by telling people, hey, I'm an artist. This is what I do. Ideally, showing them your website. And to your point, Adriana, grabbing their email address. Maybe they follow you on social media, but then you can tell them, hey, why don't I grab your email address? Because I actually have a show coming up. Even if you don't have one on the calendar yet, you'd be like, I will be having art shows in the future, and I would love to tell you about them. That's a great way. That's kind of open-ended. You're not giving them an exact date. Just say, like, this is something I'm pursuing or pushing for in my art business. Even if you've never done a group show before, never done a solo, in the next few months, I have it as a goal to have an art show, and I would love for you to be there when it happens, right? And of course, it can be a little intimidating to send email newsletters, especially in the beginning. But honestly, taking that time, and even if it is a bit more learning curve up front, sending that email newsletter can be way more beneficial than, let's say, posting 4 times on social media, right? And we've talked in other episodes and have full episodes about the power of an email newsletter in terms of, that they're going to see it in their inbox. The open rate and people that are seeing it is way higher than on social media. And as you are building that list of emails, it becomes more and more scalable, just like on a social media platform, as an easy entry point for people really getting to know you. And you're communicating with collectors and future collectors in a very intentional way. That is, to what we said, like very scalable. So realistically, even though selling in person and having that one-on-one interaction is really that bread and butter best way to interact with the collector, the newsletter really is that second best in terms of scaling and from a digital marketing standpoint, meaning that, and when we say it's scalable, meaning that it's the same amount of work for you as a business owner, whether it's being sent to one person or it's being sent to 50 people. Versus if you think of an in-person interaction, if you have a 10-minute conversation with one collector, in order to have 50 collectors, you have to have 50 10-minute conversations, which is slowly going to, like, obviously eat away at your time. And there's so many hours in the day. But the idea of a digital newsletter, you can create content that's a little bit more intimate, very direct. It's going to show up in their inbox and it's scalable. So whether there's one person, 50 people, 10,000 people on your list, it's the same amount of work for you. And everyone's going to see it, which is great.
I know you mentioning like 50 people, 10 minutes each, honestly sounds like an introverted person's worst nightmare. Even an extrovert would still probably have the sweats thinking about that one. That's a
Yeah.
lot of conversations, a lot of
Even
people,
as an
but
extrovert, I don't know if I could do that much conversation and from a
that's a
sales point
lot.
of view. So if
Yeah,
it's a
I
lot
think
for me
after
as an
person number
extrovert,
24,
yeah.
yeah, you're like already like exhausted, like I need a break. Can we continue this tomorrow? But yeah, one way to think about all this too is like, yes, things like blogs, social media content, they're fantastic, but just imagine too, you know, speaking of scalability, it's like, if you're spending 5 hours a week intentionally meeting people, talking to people, DMing people, kind of like what the results could be out of that, what the value is, the weight of it in terms of
Mhm.
relationship building, versus if you're like, I'm going to spend 5 hours a week just making videos and posts, but not really talking to people. It's like one of them, you're just kind of advertising in a way whether you intend to or not. And then the other one, you're actually asking them questions, responding, like getting to know them a little bit better, seeing if they're a good fit for your art and if you're a good fit for them. So it's like, yeah, it's a two-way street. It's a lot more valuable a lot of times. So obviously we're not saying you can't do both. You could do 5 hours of both, right? But depending what kind of time you have available, just keep an eye on that and make sure that one's not mudsliding over the other and overwhelming it. Now, of course, like I said, like we've been saying, we're not saying digital marketing is is a waste of time. It isn't. It is a part of the sales process, back in old school times, so to speak, instead of social media, another way was like artists were sending postcards, or they were sending like little greeting cards or exhibition invitations. Some of them still do the physical ones. So it's like we're just changing some of that to be online as opposed to things we send in the mail, but there's still value in it, right? Like back in the day, stores sent catalogs. It's the same thing. You're trying to get more eyeballs onto your stuff and have it result in sales. So, um, you want to share as you think of these things, you want to share as if you're talking to your collectors, and being clear on who your collectors are will help you set the tone. What kind of language you're going to use? Are you going to be like very brief? Are you more of a storyteller that does 17 paragraph emails? Or do you do just one, 3 sentences and that's it? Neither is wrong. It just depends how you present yourselves and what kind of collectors you have. But some things to think about real easy if you're like kind of stuck on this one. It's like, what do you want them to know about your work? What kind of new work are you coming up with next? What's a part of your process that is important to you, and why do you think they would be interested in it, right? As a current or future collector of your work, what makes your stuff different from that of other artists, right? Like, besides the fact that it's made by just you and there's only one of you, but what else makes your work different? And also, what kind of stories do your collectors like to hear? This is also why it's so important to have those in-person conversations, because a lot of times you can ask things like, what's something that calls your attention about my work? Or what led you to invest in my artwork? And a lot of times that gives you the kind of data that you need to then use that when you talk to additional and future collectors, right? Like, or it'll give you some of the vocabulary. I mean, it's great. Definitely worth having those conversations.
Yeah, exactly. Because to your point, in the beginning, as an artist, you're still trying to figure out your voice. You're trying to figure out what do you like about your work? What do you want your work to say? But then also that added element of what do collectors see about it? Why do they like it? Is an element that in the beginning you really are just guessing what other people think about your work. So really building and leaning on those relationships as you have your first, second, third collector, or even just potential collectors on your email list, as you meet them in person at shows, really leaning into them to learn from them about what words do they associate with your work? What are they getting from that experience of interacting with your work? That is really the bread and butter and gold in the beginning of learning from them, talking to your collectors, learning what they connect with, because that's what you will use in your messaging for your digital marketing. And on that note, next up, we're going to talk about what you can do right now to start making collectors rather than just content. But first, a quick word from our sponsors. This episode is brought to you by our Level Up Artist courses.
We understand that life as a modern artist can be both exciting and overwhelming. Plus, there's a lot of information out there. So, what do visual artists actually need?
We've spent countless hours of trial and error, weeding through tons of information to find the gold, so you don't have to waste your time going down those endless rabbit holes.
In addition to weekly calls, we have created video course modules to cover everything from artist documents to exhibition prep, social media to technology, sales strategies, artist mindset, PDF resources, templates, and so much more.
Ready to get started? Head on over to levelupartists.com to learn more, get immediate access, and level up your career today.
Welcome back, everybody. Now, of course, intentionally selling is a great goal to have, but in order to know what your goals should be, you need to establish a baseline for what you're doing now. And as we mentioned, what you are doing with your time. So we have episodes on this. Please go and look back. But essentially, you want to do a time audit. You want to use tools like Clockify, which is free. Some of you use pieces of paper, some of you use Google Calendars. It's completely up to you. But you could start with as simple as 1 week. Obviously, no 1 week is typical in an artist's life, usually, but you can start with 1 week. Track your time. You choose your categories. How much time are you spending making art? How much time are you spending making existing or potential collectors talking to people, the actual sales process? I wouldn't even add a category. How much time are you spending networking? Sometimes with other artists or art professionals that can help further your career. And definitely, how much time are you spending on admin tasks such as making digital contents? We also want you to take note of when you feel accomplished and document what you did, right? So maybe you made a TikTok, a blog, an Instagram post that made you feel really good about how it turned out, versus having an intentional conversation with a collector about your work, maybe with a gallery owner about an upcoming group exhibition opportunity. Like, take note of those. And again, of course, track your time with them. And then ask yourself which moment of feeling accomplished moved the needle in your business the most, which one initiated new conversations with current and future collectors. And, I don't have a crystal ball, but ding, 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 I bet you it's not going to be just creating content for content's sake or for algorithm's sakes.
Right, exactly. And I think that's one thing to think about when, whether you're in the middle of a time audit for a week or 2 weeks, and especially after, is that idea that, again, a gut punch realization of your time is a reflection of your priorities. So when you sit down and look at your time audit, thinking, okay, what is the way I spend my time saying about my art business and where my focus is? Because even if you feel like, oh, I really don't spend that much time making digital content, and then that's 70% of your time during the week, not saying that's wrong, but how do you feel about that? And is that what you thought it was? Is it higher than what you thought it was? Maybe it feels like you're doing other things more. And really, when you look at the time, it doesn't reflect that. So, what changes need to be made to your schedule? Where do you need to spend more time? Where do you need to spend less time? And that is now your new goal when setting up your calendar for the week and really blocking in that time into your calendar when at all possible. Of course, again, the asterisk of we all know that we as artists are full individuals with personal lives and other responsibilities as well. So there's only so many things out of your control or in your control. But looking especially for your art and art business time, where does that time allow you to be and how are you using it is really what we're focusing on. And we know that putting yourself out there is super nerve-wracking from a networking standpoint or cold DMing or cold calling, not calling, I guess you could call galleries and other
Yep.
artists, but cold emails mostly. Um, because we know that you're in a vulnerable position and this is a new process for many artists, but it does get easier over the time, especially the more you do it, because the more you want to avoid it, honestly, the scarier it'll be. And especially as artists, at least in my personal experience, every time when I'm like a little nervous to send a DM or call someone or send someone an email, they're normally super, super appreciative of understanding of building that community over competition, whether it's connecting with another artist, sharing their journey with you, or hey, I'd like to invite you to come do a studio visit in my space for a potential collector, or letting a collector know, hey, I know you came to my booth a few months ago and you were interested in this piece, but maybe it was out of your budget at the time. I'm following up. I have similar pieces from this series. And just showing that you took that time, remember the relationship, and then are building on it really goes a long way. So yes, it can be scary putting yourself out there. It can be a little nerve-wracking, but it does get easier with time. And really, what's the worst that could happen? Like most of the time with messages, like you don't get a response. Okay,
No
great.
big
On
deal.
to the next.
Yeah. Or they say no, and that's okay too. Bye.
Yeah.
Next. Yeah, yeah. That's a whole nother conversation. Actually, we have ones about inner critics that's helpful too. Those they tend to pop up when we feel vulnerable. So there's that. But the best thing you can do for your business, like I said, definitely look at your time, and then set intentional, focus time, right? To get out there, to talk to people, to slide into DMs, to share with people who you are, what you do, and start or maintain relationships with current and future collectors. I mean, that's going to pay off a lot better than I was in the basement 80 hours this week. Like that's all I did, just making stuff. That's great. I'm sure you made some cool stuff, but if nobody knows it exists, nobody's going to buy it. So definitely need to spend time doing that. And then for those of you that like to hyper focus on the admin side, not naming any names, ha ha ha, just make sure you also spend the time to make the art. So just check what that balance is. See how you feel about how much time you're spending on all these different parts of your art and art business. Give them all a little love, give them all a little check, and adjustment if necessary. But yeah, your art matters. No one will know about it if you don't tell them. You got this. We're rooting for you. We're gonna wrap up the conversation here because we can keep going on this soapbox. Tell you to get out there and spend some time building relationships. But we'll leave it there for now. We hope you enjoyed this episode.
As always, our blog will be linked in today's show notes, where you can find episode notes and links to all of our other podcast episodes.
If you want to stay connected with us in between episodes, share your feedback, or have a question you would like for us to answer on the podcast, you can reach us through social media. I'm at Mayart across all platforms.
And I'm at J Sanders Studio on all platforms. And if you want to follow the podcast, we are at Level Up Artists on Instagram.
You can also visit levelupartist.com to get immediate access to templates, resources, and course modules to level up your creative career today.
Thank you so much for listening. We'll talk to you next week.